McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome to the McCuistion program, and this is actually our second in a two-part series on extremism, and I have my co-host Jim Falk here. Jim is the CEO and President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and Jim, you did such a great job on the last program. I'm going to let you tell this audience of what we're doing on this program as well.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me back. After 9/11, laws were changed and the Patriot Act was implemented with the understandable objective of protecting the homeland. As we have seen, violent extremism is not just international, it is also homegrown. The ideology that foments terror can be imported, or it may be an indigenous hate group calling for white supremacy. The law differs on how international and domestic terrorism are addressed. What are the stakes, and how do we ensure that we are protected without infringing on our constitutional rights and liberties? To discuss these important topics, we have with us Sahar Aziz. She's joining us via Skype. She's a professor of law and the Chancellor's social justice scholar at Rutgers Law School. She's also the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which engages in research and advocacy on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the United States. Here from New York, Marc Stern. He's the Chief Legal Officer for the American Jewish Committee. He arrived at the AJC from the American Jewish Congress, where he was General Counsel, and he earned his JD degree from the Columbia University School of Law. Thank you both for being with us. Marc, I'd like to begin our conversation by asking you, how do we treat, under the law, domestic and international terrorism? Because there really are some strong differences.
There are differences primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in the areas of surveillance and when the government can intervene before a full-fledged crime is committed. Once somebody is killed, or somebody is assaulted, a building is blown up or set on fire, the differences become much smaller because those are complete crimes. There are smaller differences, but the major differences that are two with regard to international terrorism versus domestic terrorism. With regard to international terrorism, the Patriot Act very much relaxed the standards for government surveillance of phone calls, of computer records, and the like. The actions were controversial at the time. They're still in place. Congress has repeatedly renewed them, and they give the government the ability to listen in on people overseas or groups overseas that they think may be in contact with people in the United States trying to arrange acts of violence with the purpose of changing our political system. Those authorities don't exist to most instances of domestic terrorism. Now, if you have information that somebody's about to blow up a building, that's a crime, and the ordinary investigative tools apply. But they're more restricted than the tools available in international terrorism. That's one major difference. Another major difference in law is that there's a statute called the Material Support Statute, which says that if I aid an international terrorist group that the government has already declared to be a terrorist group. And this could be
financial aid.
Financial aid, it could be going to a training base overseas. It can be spreading propaganda from a foreign terrorist group that's been certified as such by the government. That's already a crime. Even though no physical act has been committed, nobody has been directly harmed in the United States, that's a crime already. That's material support. It's been a very valuable tool, controversial but valuable tool the government has invoked often with regard to overseas terrorism. There is no counterpart to that in American law for domestic terrorism. Now, there are ways of getting those things, concepts well known in law, conspiracy, which is a group agreement to commit a crime, or an attempt to commit a crime. But they're much harder to apply. Juries don't like them as much. And so those are two major legal differences. And of course, there's a rhetorical difference. We talk about one as terrorism. We tend not to talk about domestic acts of violence as terrorism.
Help me understand the mechanics that are needed to classify an organization as being a terrorist organization.
The authority is in the State Department. They make a preliminary determination. They offer the group some opportunity to respond. They don't get to see all the documents that the government is basing its determination on. And then the secretary makes a final determination. It's it's an unusual process in terms of normal due process.
Does it have to be renewed on an annual basis?
No.
All right, before you go to Sahar to respond to that, is it a good idea in your estimation to have two different standards? In other words, I could make the case that as an American citizen, maybe I don't want the same kind of degree of surveillance here. Is that a good idea or something that needs to be changed from your perspective?
I'm agnostic on that question. It's a very good question. The Supreme Court has in two cases indicated that while they have been willing to permit enhanced surveillance under reduced scrutiny for foreign terrorism or foreign activity hostile to the United States, they weren't taking a position whether the same rules ought to apply to parallel conduct, but that was domestically based. So that's where in constitutional theory, that's where this distinction runs. You can argue that one either way. I think the received wisdom till now is that because threats of terrorism inevitably have a political tinge to them, that you're involved in conduct that is partially about ideas and partially is about using violence to coerce a change. And so to take the context of abortion, for instance, calling doctors murderers, doctors who perform abortions murderers, is that inciting people to commit crimes? And it was a time when doctors who committed abortion were more than physically threatened, were actually killed. Or is that silencing opposition to abortion, stating in stark terms what's at issue? And so people have been afraid to enter that thicket because they're not quite sure how to draw those lines. Whether given the recent spate of very deadly domestic terror attacks, Charleston, Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, and so on, whether we ought to consider changing that balance is a fair question, but which is very hard to answer, and I don't have a firm answer for myself yet.
Let's bring Sahar into the conversation. Sahar, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, so I think we need to start with what the definition of terrorism is, which there is no universal definition, and there is much dispute both domestically and internationally as to what constitutes terrorism, because the perennial debate is one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, which alludes to the fact that there is a political component to determination of whether someone is a terrorist, because the primary definition is focused on the motivation for the violence. And the violence is aimed at intimidating a civilian population or coercing a government to engage in certain actions or refrain from engaging in certain actions, and motivated by political ideology. And one could argue that political ideology could come in the guise of religion or in the guise of some other form, but ultimately it is a political objective. So I think that's the core of it. And then the question is, how do you prosecute that without, particularly in the domestic context, without engaging in the policing of thought or the infringement on political speech or political expression, even if it's unpopular, even if it's distasteful? Obviously, if it's violence, that's an easy case. It's the preventative aspect of counterterrorism that implicates First Amendment rights. How do you prevent terrorism from happening? And how much surveillance can you conduct that is legitimate versus that is racially profiling, religiously profiling, and effectively predicting that certain people are more susceptible to committing terrorism, violence, right, that's politically motivated as a result of their identity, their religious identity, their racial identity. And it's unconstitutional to presume that someone is more susceptible to being a criminal based on these immutable characteristics.
And certainly we've seen some of that with the terrorist watch list, for instance.
Yes. For example, the terrorist watch list is notorious for two major flaws. The first is inaccuracy, and many inaccurate names that shouldn't be there. We saw that with Ted Kennedy when he was alive, and many other famous people who were in government. But also that it is disproportionately comprised of people who are Muslim or Arab, which then challenges the legitimacy of the process of how you get on there. Now, one thing that Marc mentioned, which I think is quite relevant here, is why terrorism is easier to prosecute domestically when it has an international component. Because our terrorism laws, particularly material terrorism, material support to terrorism laws, are based on designations of foreign terrorist global organizations, so FTOs, or specially designated global terrorists, SDGTs. So one is by the Treasury and one is by the State Department, but all of them are international. So that also then implicates immigrants, so people who are from Muslim majority countries who may be engaging in innocuous activities or at least not engaging in violence, but by virtue of phone calls they make, places they go visit, they're going to visit back home, and maybe at those locations there are terrorist groups. What happens is they're getting ensnared in this web, in this material terrorism investigatory web, by virtue of the fact that they're Muslim. But it's not necessarily because they're actually supporting those terrorist organizations in terms of why they're being investigated.
Yeah, Sahar, let me ask you two questions. First, are you a member of the National Rifle Association?
No, I'm not.
Okay. San Francisco, as you probably noticed, just in the last few days, their Board of Trustees has now designated unanimously that the NRA is a domestic terrorist organization. Your thoughts about that, please?
Well, now you're getting into Second Amendment rights, and it is actually not illegal. Let's look at another context which most Americans will find not controversial in terms of designating a group, but also protects First Amendment rights in this case. So, for example, you have the organization Hamas, which has been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, by Israel, and some other even Middle Eastern countries. It is not a violation of American law to be a member of Hamas. That is considered protected. What is illegal is you cannot provide material support to them. So going back to the NRA, it's problematic on many fronts to designate them as terrorists, and frankly, I don't think that they have the
Thank you very much.
authority
Yes,
to do
thank
so.
you.
You're going to show us your card right now?
I'm not a member either, but I just didn't want to, make sure. Go ahead,
Marc,
Sahar.
one of the things I wanted to ask you is we are seeing, sadly, an increase in anti-Semitic violence. What is the difference between a hate crime versus a terrorist act?
I don't find these discussions and these distinctions terribly productive.
But it is a matter of law, isn't it? The way.
Well, hate crimes are ordinary crimes that get an extra sentence because they're motivated by hate. Domestic terrorism, as Professor Sahar said, involves some effort to use the violence to coerce some political result. It just puts an added burden on prosecutors when you're dealing with somebody like Dylan Roof or the fellow in Pittsburgh to prove that they intended this coercive means as opposed to just eliminating their enemies. And the sentences are going to be, after all, both Dylan Roof and the fellow in Pittsburgh either have gotten or likely to receive death sentences, certainly multiple life sentences. I'm not sure how all important it is to distinguish between anti-Semitic violence as a hate crime and as domestic terrorism. I don't know that it's going to make a huge difference under the current regime. What is important is that there's a symbolic effect. It is true that most of the people indicted and convicted of the material support for terrorism laws have been associated with Islamic groups overseas. So the perception is in the United States that violence is fine if it's not Muslim, it's terrorism if it is. There's a certain sense in Muslim communities that they're not getting equal treatment with their equivalent domestic counterparts. And so I'm not sure how much real difference it makes in the world, but it would eliminate that sense of grievance, which is real and legitimate, that two people do the same act, they do it with the purpose of coercing government or people to take a particular political position. One gets called a terrorist and the other doesn't. And so that might remove that irritant. But whether doing so would make any difference in minimizing the number of attacks is very doubtful.
But they're not, and she rightfully defined the terrorism thing, but you can have people just go kill people. They're not trying to influence anything except they're trying to either commit suicide or they're crazy, or maybe they just like to shoot. Maybe some people have said that there's a real adrenaline rush to killing people, as an example. It was a strange thing, but nevertheless, that's not an act of terrorism. No. That's just a crime, whether it's a hate crime or not a crime. Okay, Sahar, let me go back to you. I want to finish this thing about, because you are from Dallas, and you mentioned Hamas. In the previous program that we did, we had Buck Revell on, and Buck was one of the people involved in the Holy Land Foundation here, in which CARE, among other people, were unindicted co-conspirators because of their material support of Hamas, if I'm not mistaken. Isn't that true, number one? And then secondly, is that what part of this material support that you were talking about?
So I have written an article on the Holy Land Foundation. It was published in the Texas Civil Liberties and Civil Rights Journal in 2003. And I'd welcome viewers to take a look at it. And it was a very controversial case, primarily because the factual allegations were that the Holy Land Foundation, which was an American nonprofit that had been very successful in providing humanitarian aid across the world, primarily to Muslim-majority countries, including Bosnia and Kashmir and Palestine, and places where there were conflicts and civilians needed that humanitarian aid. And they had provided that aid to hospitals and schools and civil society services. Their claim was our intent was to help these civilians. However, because it was in Gaza, Hamas governs Gaza. And so it's very difficult to have any organization not have a member of Hamas on their board, or perhaps a member of Hamas is donating also to the hospital. So all that is to say, they were convicted on this very dubious legal theory, which I have critiqued in my writing, called the fungibility of money argument, which is, even though there's no evidence that you provided them with guns or that you sent members of Hamas to fight for Hamas or to engage in violence for Hamas or to do any of the violent terrorist activities that Hamas does, what you did, though, is by providing money to hospitals and other social service organizations that Hamas allegedly supports, including also the Red Cross would support those organizations, you freed up the funds for Hamas to then use for arms and violence, which was a very speculative claim. And it was a highly problematic case because there were also anonymous informants, et cetera. So that's where you get into the politicization of material support terrorism. But also, the unindicted co-conspirator list, I also challenged that in my writings because it was really a smear campaign against American Muslim organizations. There had been no evidence that CARE was even involved in any of the activities that Holy Land Foundation was being tried for. And it was effectively a smear to say anyone who's a conservative Muslim, and particularly if you're a civil society organization that's a conservative Muslim in the US, we suspect you of being sympathetic, if not outright supportive of terrorism. If they had really been engaged in material support, they would have been indicted. The government has been very aggressive in its anti-terrorism prosecutions. If there's one thing that gets you a promotion in the FBI, it's prosecuting Muslims for anti-terrorism, which is in contrast to white supremacists. And I want to go back to what Marc said about the definition of terrorism. So when you see the hate crimes, he's correct. A hate crime is simply about what's the motivation. Why did you commit this otherwise regular crime? The problem is when somebody goes and shoots up a predominantly Black church, is it simply about he wants to kill those African American people and his motivation is he holds anti-Black racism, or is his motivation to intimidate Black people, to intimidate a subgroup of our population? And if that's the answer, which if you ask many African Americans will say, yes, this was very intimidating. We didn't feel safe going to our churches. We didn't feel safe in general. And we didn't see this as simply about the victims at this church because the racial motivation was not, it had broader implications. And if you compare that to the Orlando club shooter, who was a single, it was called a lone wolf terrorist, but he had mental health problems. He went into a gay bar and he started shooting many people and happened to have posted something on Facebook. So that could have been a hate crime against LGBT communities, but instead it was also seen as terrorism, even though there was no evidence that he was even a member of a foreign terrorist organization. My point is not to say that this should be tried like this or this should be tried like that, but more to show that there's inconsistency, and a lot of it has to do with the identity of the perpetrator.
Sahar, after some of these instances of domestic terrorism over the course of the last several months, there's been a great deal of discussion about perhaps a need to change some of our domestic laws. Do you agree, and what laws do need to be modified?
Well, my position is that counterterrorism laws have become too expansive. So I do not agree that we should take anti-terrorism laws that are engaging in scope creep in terms of justifying mass surveillance, as we saw with the NYPD surveillance program of Rutgers University students and students across the East Coast and mosques and businesses, and say, now let's take that and apply it to white people who hold conservative views or to conservative churches. I find that whole practice to be highly problematic from a constitutional perspective, particularly First Amendment perspective. I would much rather have the government focus its efforts on action-based, looking at evidence that someone is planning a terrorist act. And terrorist act should be defined, we have to keep the definition that is aimed at coercing a population. And that population can be racial minorities. It can be religious minorities. And that's where there's going to be there needs to be some discussion as to, there are some things that are hate crimes. In other words, I really wanted to kill one person, two people because they were Black, because they were Muslim, because they were Jewish, versus I want to terrorize Jews in America. I want to terrorize Blacks in America. And so I'm going to engage in this mass shooting as a way to intimidate them. Maybe so they don't go out and vote. Maybe so that they don't practice their religious freedom rights and go to their synagogues and their mosques and their churches. Maybe because they're scared to be in public. That would be in the case. Okay. So on the one hand, we broaden what we consider as coercing or intimidating a civilian population, but we narrow how the the investigators investigate anti-terrorism to focus on actions and not political beliefs and ideology.
Okay, thanks. Let me, since you broaden things, and let me just broaden this thing to you, Marc, this idea of the U.S.'s role globally in this whole issue. Give us some idea of what you guys are thinking that.
Well, the question that is now one of the central debates about foreign policy, and has been for some time, and it makes odd bedfellows sometimes of the left and the right, whether the United States ought to withdraw from its commitments overseas, or whether it ought to continue its role as a leading global power. And the left has been isolationist often.
Right is
part of the right is isolationist. They don't agree about anything else. And many of our friends around the world tell us that they feel left alone, that without the United States, in the world, active in the world, addressing problems in the world, less benign forces come to the fore, and there are problems that are beyond the reach of many countries to deal with on their own. They need a superpower to help them, and we used to be that address. Question whether the United States has that ability going forward. And as I say, if you look at the Democratic primary and you look at President Trump, sometimes on international affairs, it's sometimes hard to tell who's who. And yet there...
Well, sadly, there's not been enough discussion, and there rarely is, in foreign affairs.
I just want to make 2 points about what Sahar said. I don't want to relitigate the Holy Land case. And it is problematic to name people as unindicted co-conspirators when they have no opportunity to clear their name in a trial. I don't think it's quite as simple as Sahar makes it with regard to the idea that money is fungible. Any good accountant
we know that.
can hide that. Yeah. But more importantly, terrorist groups around the world, and not only Hamas, gain credibility amongst local populations by providing social services that the governments are not providing, and they engage in their terrorism. So it's not, it is true, it poses some real problems in practice and in law and theory, but it seems to me blind to the realities of the way terrorists gain support for their activities to pretend that those things are neatly severable. And finally,
I can see we're going to have to spend a lot more time. We'll probably have to do another program on this.
And unfortunately, we're out of time, and that's
we
the problem.
invite you to New Jersey.
But let me thank you, Marc. Let me thank
will.
you, and let me thank Sahar. Recent acts of terror that have been incited by domestic hate underscore the need for there to be careful deliberation on how our laws are adapted to address these threats. As you've heard, these are sensitive and emotional issues that affect the very fabric of our society. You can be sure that Dennis and I will be talking about things that matter with people who care. I hope you'll follow us on Twitter, and be sure to check McCuistionTV.com for other important topics. And thanks for tuning in.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.